The multiverse does not bleed cleanly. When it tears, it does so like a wound that refuses to close, ragged at the edges, hot with something older than physics, and deeply, profoundly wrong in a way that only those who have spent their lives reading the hidden language of danger can feel before it happens. Oberyn Martell felt it 3 seconds before the rift swallowed him whole. He had been in the shadow of a collapsing tower in Essos, following a thread of conspiracy that led from Dorne to Volantis to something older and fouler than either. A sorcerer's ritual carved into the stone floor of a room that should not have existed, written in a script that mixed High Valyrian with something that predated it by centuries. He had his spear. He had his poisons. He had the particular quality of attention that had kept him alive through 40 years of a world that wanted men like him dead. And then the floor had opened up. Not collapsed, not crumbled, but opened like a mouth. And the city of Gotham had received him the way it received everything. Badly. He hit the alley floor at speed, rolled with the instinct of a man trained since boyhood to treat every surface as either weapon or landing pad, and came up in a fighting stance, facing nothing but rain and the distant mechanical groan of a city that smelled of industry and rot, and something chemical underneath both. His spear was still in his hand. His dark eyes swept the alley. Brick walls slick with moisture, a dumpster that hadn't been emptied in what smelled like weeks. Light from a street beyond casting orange shadows through falling rain. No sorcerer, no ritual circle, no Essos. Somewhere above him, a gargoyle stared down from a building that looked as though it had been designed by someone with a profound hatred of right angles and a deep personal relationship with Gothic architecture. Oberyn lowered his spear by 3 inches. Not all the way. Never all the way, in an unknown place. Interesting, he said to no one. He was bleeding from a cut above his left eye. The rift's edge had caught him on the way through, or something had, and the rain mixed with blood in a way that would have concerned a lesser man. Oberyn touched the wound with 2 fingers, assessed it as superficial, and began to move toward the street with the fluid, unhurried stride of a man who had walked into hostile courts, hostile cities, and hostile bedchambers across 2 continents, and understood that urgency advertised vulnerability. The street beyond the alley was unlike anything in his experience, and yet immediately comprehensible in its bones. A city, a large one, poor in these streets, clearly, though the towers he could see rising in the distance suggested wealth somewhere above the waterline. People moved under awnings and umbrellas, nobody looking at anyone else with the particular metropolitan discipline of those who had learned that eye contact invited conversation and conversation invited obligation. A vendor sold something from a cart. 2 men in heavy coats argued near a doorway. An advertisement on a crumbling wall showed a man in a suit with a smile that did not reach his eyes, above text that read, Luther 2024, because humanity deserves better. Oberyn studied the advertisement for a long moment. Politician, he thought. Wealthy. Promises something impossible. Blames something inhuman. The formula was ancient and apparently universal. He spent the first hour simply watching. It was what his father had taught him and what his own experience had confirmed. A new place revealed itself fastest to those patient enough to let it. He watched the vehicles and understood they were self-propelled. He watched a woman use a small glowing rectangle to speak to someone at a distance and filed it under far glass. Advanced. He watched 2 uniformed men, police clearly, the posture and the casual authority were the same in every culture, ignore a man bleeding on a corner with the practiced disinterest of officers who had decided the calculus didn't favor intervention. Might he help the bleeding man, because Oberyn Martell had many flaws, and indifference to suffering was not among them. Bound the wound with a strip torn from his own sash, listened to the man's fractured explanation of the city. Gotham City, you don't know Gotham. And received in return a rushed geography of the neighborhood, a warning about something called the Narrows, and an expression of bewildered gratitude. By the second hour, he had established that he was somewhere beyond any map he possessed, in a city with its own gravity. The kind of place that pulled darkness toward it like a lodestone. By the third hour, standing in the rain outside a building whose architecture suggested old money and older secrets, He had established something else. He was being followed. Not badly. Whoever it was had genuine skill. But Oberyn had been followed by faceless men, by Lannister spies, by assassins who had trained for decades in the art of invisible pursuit. He had a sense for it the way a sailor had a sense for weather. The presence behind him was controlled, patient, and radiating the specific energy of someone trying to determine threat level before committing to engagement. He stopped walking, turned slowly, looked directly at the shadow between two buildings that was slightly too still to be architectural. "You've been following me since the alley," Oberyn said pleasantly. "You're very good. I've been followed by better, but not many." The shadow didn't move. "I have no interest in this city's criminal enterprises, if that's your concern. I have no allies here. Wait, no enemies here, yet, and no particular agenda beyond understanding where I am and how I arrived." He tilted his head. "I suspect you already know where I arrived from, or you wouldn't have bothered following at all. You'd have simply sent police." A long pause, rain on stone, distant siren. "You came through a dimensional breach," said a voice from the shadow, low, controlled, stripped of warmth the way a weapon is stripped of everything unnecessary. 6 blocks east, 40 minutes ago. I've had the area monitored since the energy signature registered. And yet you followed, rather than confronted." Oberyn smiled. "You wanted to see what I would do first. You're a careful man." The shadow moved and Batman stepped into the orange light of the street lamp, cape shedding rain in dark rivers, whilst the white lenses of his cowl giving nothing away about the eyes behind them. Oberyn looked at him for a moment. The armor, the ears, the deliberate architecture of intimidation, and felt a professional appreciation mixed with something sharper. This was not a man playing at danger. This was a man who was danger, refined and directed. "Dramatic," Oberyn observed, "but effective. You dress like fear itself. I respect the philosophy." "Who are you?" Batman said. Oberyn considered lying, assessed the intelligence clearly radiating from behind those white lenses, decided against it, and told the truth instead. "My name is Oberyn Martell. I am a Prince of Dorne, a place that does not exist in your geography. I arrived here against my will through means I don't yet fully understand." He met the white lenses without flinching. "And you, Alma, I think, are the reason this city fears the dark. If you want to see more characters enter different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below." Hope shines brightest in the darkest night. Batman did not respond immediately. This was, Oberyn had learned over a lifetime of reading powerful men, itself a form of communication. Silence from the weak was hesitation. Silence from the strong was assessment. The man in the black armor was running calculations, processing the dimensional breach data, the fighting stance, the spear, the accent, the controlled lack of fear, and arriving at conclusions that his expression, what little of it the cowl permitted, did not yet reveal. Oberyn waited him out. He was exceptionally good at waiting. "One, you're not afraid," Batman said finally. It was not a compliment. It was a data point being entered into a mental ledger, and the ledger's ultimate conclusion remained unknown. "I've faced men who could crush a stone with their hand," Oberyn replied. "I've faced poison that dissolves the mind before the body. I've sat at tables with people who had decided before the meal was served that I would not survive the evening." He glanced at the cowl, the cape, the deliberate silhouette. "You're wearing a costume designed to make men's hearts seize with primal terror. It's excellent work, but I've seen the thing the costume is meant to imitate, and you are not it." Something shifted in Batman's posture. Not offense. The man was too disciplined for that, but recalibration. He had expected fear, or bravado masking fear, when received instead a calm comparative analysis. It changed the nature of the encounter in ways both of them understood without stating. "Come with me," Batman said. "Where?" "Somewhere dry, where we can talk without 14 surveillance cameras recording the conversation." Oberyn considered this for exactly as long as it deserved. A man who knew about the surveillance cameras was either the one who had installed them or the one who had long since mapped and memorized every blind spot in his city. Either way, It suggested a relationship with control and information that Oberon found simultaneously admirable and worth watching carefully. "Lead on," he said. The Batcave was, Oberon decided, the work of a man who had taken grief and refined it into function the way a swordsmith took raw ore and refined it into edge. Every surface served a purpose. The computer systems glowed with data in quantities that suggested a mind that trusted nothing to chance and everything to preparation. Trophies in cases, a giant coin, a mechanical dinosaur, other objects whose significance was clearly personal, suggested a man who kept his victories visible not from vanity, but from the same impulse that made soldiers keep the scars of old battles rather than heal them cleanly. Remember what it cost. Remember what you survived. Oberon understood this completely. He sat where he was directed, across a workbench from Batman, who had not removed the cowl, which was itself a statement about trust levels, and accepted a dry cloth for his still bleeding temple, with the grace of someone accustomed to receiving hospitality in hostile territory. "The breach that brought you here," Batman began, pulling up a holographic display that showed energy readings Oberon couldn't interpret but could recognize as significant by the way Batman's jaw tightened looking at them. "It's the fourth this month in Gotham alone. The multiverse is destabilized. Something punched holes in the barriers between realities during an event 6 months ago involving dark matter and entities from what we call the dark multiverse." He looked at Oberon directly. "You're not the first person to come through. You may not be the last. You're telling me this freely," Oberon observed. "Either you've determined I'm harmless, which I doubt is your conclusion, or you want something from me." "Information," Batman said. "Your world, its physics, its magic system, the nature of whatever ritual opened the breach on your end. The more I understand about what's tearing these holes, the faster I can close them. And in exchange, you don't spend your first night in Gotham in a holding cell." Oberon smiled. "A negotiation conducted entirely from a position of assumed power. You're very like the lords I grew up navigating." He pressed the cloth to his temple and regarded the detective steadily. "I'll tell you what I know about the ritual. In exchange, you'll tell me where I am with genuine specificity, and you'll answer one question honestly." A pause. "Depending on the question." "Of course." Oberon set the cloth down. "The ritual I witnessed was old. Pre-Valyrian, I believe. Carved in a script that predated the Freehold. Someone in my world was attempting to open a passage to somewhere else deliberately. I interrupted the ritual, which is likely why the breach was unstable. What it was intended to connect to, I don't yet know." He tilted his head. "Your turn." "Where precisely am I?" Batman told him. "Gotham City, a world of extraordinary individuals, some born to power, some made by tragedy, some given gifts by accident or alien biology, or the particular stubbornness of the human will. A world where a man in a cape could move faster than lightning, and another could bend steel with his hands, and a third had once died and returned wearing the black of vengeance and the red of something that hadn't fully healed." He gave Oberon the shape of the world with the efficiency of someone delivering a tactical briefing, stripped of wonder, heavy on operational detail. Oberon listened to all of it without interrupting. When Batman finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Gods," Oberon said. "You have actual gods." "We have people with godlike power," Batman said, with the carefully measured distinction of a man who had spent considerable time thinking about the difference. "It's not the same thing." "In my experience," Oberon replied quietly, "the distinction matters only to the people without the power. To everyone else, the effect is identical." He looked around the cave. The dark, the preparation, the trophies, the endless humming readiness of a man who had decided to fight gods with wit and will and refusal. "Which is, I think, why you built all of this." Batman said nothing. Which was, Oberon was learning, his version of agreement. "My question," Oberon said. "I want to ask it." "The boy." He had seen the photographs on the workbench before Batman had noticed him looking. Impossible to hide a Dornish prince's eyes once they decided to catalog a room. A young man, dark-haired, gray-eyed, carrying himself with the posture of someone who had learned to make themselves smaller than they were. Northern in his bearing, familiar in some quality that Oberon couldn't yet name, but that pulled at the investigative instinct honed over 40 years of following conspiracies to their roots. Who is he? Batman's stillness changed quality. It became the stillness of a man deciding how much to reveal, rather than the stillness of a man simply thinking. A ward, he said. Someone I'm protecting. From what? That, Batman said, is a second question. Oberyn conceded the point with a small nod. But he filed the non-answer in the same place he filed every evasion from a powerful man, under significant and worth returning to, and the truth is in what wasn't said. He would return to it. He always did. Bruce Wayne had not intended for Oberyn Martell to meet Jon Snow. He had, in fact, constructed a careful architecture of separation between his various responsibilities. The kind of compartmentalization that kept operatives safe, kept secrets intact, and kept the people he protected from becoming entangled in each other's gravity. He had learned across decades of doing this badly, and then better, that the most dangerous collisions were not the ones you planned for, but the ones that occurred in the spaces between your plans. Jon Snow was eating breakfast in the manor kitchen when Oberyn walked in, and Alfred had installed the Dornish prince in one of the guest suites at 3 in the morning, with the unflappable hospitality of a man who had long since stopped being surprised by what the cave produced. And Oberyn had apparently risen with the dawn, followed the smell of food with the directness of a man who had learned that in unfamiliar territory, the kitchen told you more about a household than any formal room. He pushed open the door and stopped. Jon looked up from his bowl, dark hair, gray eyes, the particular quality of stillness that belonged to people who had grown up in cold places where noise attracted danger. He was perhaps 20 years old, perhaps slightly older. It was difficult to tell with people who had been weathered young. And he wore his uncertainty about this house, this city, with this world the way he wore his clothing, adequately concealing it, but not entirely. They looked at each other across the kitchen. Oberyn's mind did what it always did when it encountered a face, cross-referenced it against every face he had cataloged across 40 years of courts and battlefields and beds and negotiating tables, looking for architecture, for lineage, for the particular bone structure that families passed down like heirlooms, whether they intended to or not. What he found stopped his breath for exactly 1 second. He recovered smoothly, because he had been trained to, and crossed to the table and sat down across from the young man with the easy manner of someone making a social call. "You must be the ward," Oberyn said pleasantly. "I'm a guest, Oberyn." "Jon," the young man said, careful, measuring. Bruce Wayne's household apparently trained its members in the same fundamental wariness, regardless of age. "You came through one of the breaches?" "I did." Oberyn helped himself to bread from the board on the table. Alfred had apparently anticipated guests, because there was always more than enough, and studied Jon Snow with the relaxed attention of a man who had perfected the art of looking at something intensely while appearing to look at nothing in particular. "You're not from here either." It wasn't a question. Jon's eyes sharpened slightly at it. "What makes you say that? You carry yourself like someone from a cold place, not merely a cold city, a cold culture. There's a quality to people raised where winter is not a season, but a philosophy, a certain economy of movement, a distrust of unnecessary warmth." Oberyn broke the bread. "Also, you have the eyes of someone who arrived somewhere and decided to survive it, rather than someone who grew up belonging to it." A long silence. Jon looked at his bowl. "Bruce says I should avoid talking about where I'm from," he said finally. "Bruce is very wise," Oberyn agreed. "And yet here you are, having already confirmed that where you're from is somewhere you shouldn't discuss, which is itself a significant piece of information." He smiled without sharpness. "Don't worry, I have no interest in whatever's threatening you. I'm simply a man trying to understand a new world, and you appear to be doing the same." Jon studied him with those gray eyes for a long moment. Eyes that had seen, Oberyn now suspected, considerably more than 20 years had any right to deposit, and seemed to reach some internal conclusion. "North," Jon said. "I'm from somewhere north." And that was all he said. But it was enough, combined with everything else, to set Oberyn's mind moving along a track it would not leave for the rest of the day. He found Alfred in the garden an hour later, pruning something with the methodical attention of a man who used physical tasks to process complex problems. "The boy," Oberon said without preamble. "John, how long has he been here?" Alfred clipped a branch with surgical precision. "Approximately 8 months, sir." "He came through a breach?" "He did. Unlike most who have come through, he arrived with a specific request, that his identity not be disclosed, and that he be given time to understand his circumstances before deciding his next course." Alfred set down his shears and regarded Oberon with the particular quality of attention that distinguished truly intelligent servants from merely efficient ones. Mr. Wayne found this reasonable. "I imagine he did." Oberon looked back at the manor's windows. The boy's face, his coloring, the structure of his jaw. He said it carefully, the way you approached a conclusion you weren't sure you wanted to reach. "In my world, there are certain bloodlines that leave marks on a face the way dynasties leave marks on maps. Unavoidable. Architectural." He paused. "Tell me, Alfred, has anyone in this world ever heard of House Targaryen?" Alfred was quiet for a moment that lasted precisely long enough to confirm that the answer was not simply no. "Yeah, I believe," Alfred said finally, choosing words with the care of a man diffusing something, "that Mr. Wayne would want to be present for this particular conversation." "I imagine he would," Oberon said. "Where is he?" "Currently," Alfred said, "dealing with a situation in the city that requires his particular expertise." Oberon nodded slowly. He looked at the manor. He thought about gray eyes and a bone structure that matched a lineage he had spent years tracing through the courts of a different world. He thought about a ritual carved in pre-Valyrian script that someone had used to open a door between realities. Not accidentally, he was increasingly certain, but deliberately, with specific intent. Someone had sent him here, or sent Jon Snow here, or engineered their proximity for reasons that were not yet visible. He had spent his life learning that the most dangerous conspiracies were the ones that looked, at first examination, like coincidence. "I'll wait," Oberon said, and his voice carried the particular quality of a man who had found the thread he intended to follow to its end, no matter what the end looked like. Above them, from a window on the manor's third floor, Jon Snow watched the Dornish prince in the garden and felt, with the instinct of someone who had learned to trust such things, that something had just irrevocably changed. Lex Luthor did not believe in coincidence. He believed in patterns, in causality, in the fundamental principle that every apparently random event was simply a planned one whose architect hadn't yet been identified. He had built an empire on this belief, had used it to dismantle competitors, won outmaneuver governments, and maintain the singular conviction that the universe was a problem to be solved rather than a mystery to be endured. Coincidence was what inferior minds called the things they hadn't yet understood. So when his surveillance network, the one that blanketed Gotham in a web of sensors and cameras that Commissioner Gordon suspected existed, and Batman had partially mapped and neither had fully neutralized, flagged a dimensional breach in the East End at 2:47 in the morning, followed within 4 hours by an energy signature consistent with a second extra-dimensional presence in Wayne Manor, Lex did not call it coincidence. He called it an opportunity. He was in his Metropolis penthouse when the report reached him, reviewing it across a breakfast that cost more than most people's monthly income, with the detached attention of a man for whom luxury had long since ceased to register as anything but background noise. The breach data was interesting, but not unprecedented. The multiverse had been leaking since Metal, and he had files on 11 confirmed extra-dimensional arrivals in the past 6 months. What made this particular report worth setting down his coffee for was the second signal. Wayne Manor. Bruce Wayne was sheltering something, had been, Lex's analysts now confirmed, for approximately 8 months. A presence that registered on certain esoteric sensors, the ones Lex had developed in consultation with scientists who worked in the spaces between physics and magic, as fundamentally other, not metahuman, not Kryptonian, not magical in the DC native sense. Something older and stranger, carrying the residue of a reality that operated on different principles. Lex had been patient about this, because patience was a weapon, and he had learned to keep his best weapons sheathed until the moment was correct. But 2 extra-dimensional signatures in Wayne's orbit in a single night suggested the moment was becoming urgent. He pressed a button on his desk. "Get me Mercy," and pull everything we have on extra-dimensional biology and pre-technological magical systems. He arrived in Gotham by private car, not the ostentatious limousine that his public persona required, but the unmarked vehicle that belonged to the version of Lex Luthor that existed in the spaces between press conferences. He had, over the years, developed a relationship with Gotham's information economy that bypassed its official power structures entirely. There were people in this city who sold what they knew to whoever paid most reliably, and Lex had made a point of being the most reliable buyer. Within 3 hours of landing, he had a partial profile of the new arrival. Oberyn Martell. No records in any database on Earth, which itself told him everything. Another extra-dimensional, then confirming the breach data. Weapons trained, combat capable. Had spent his first night in Gotham not panicking, not causing damage, but observing, which suggested a sophisticated intelligence operating inside an unfamiliar situation. Had been taken directly to Wayne Manor by Batman, which meant Batman had assessed him as either trustworthy or controllable, and Batman's assessments, when however much Lex resented acknowledging it, were rarely wrong, but it was the third piece of information that made Lex sit forward in the car's leather seat. His man inside the Manor staff, not Alfred, who was impenetrable, but a groundskeeper 3 steps removed from the inner household, had reported one detail of the morning's events that everyone else had apparently missed. The new arrival had spent an hour in the garden with Alfred. The conversation had been brief. The groundskeeper had caught only fragments. One fragment, House Targaryen. Lex sat with this word for a long moment, the way he sat with all genuinely interesting information. Not reaching for it, not reacting to it, simply letting it exist in his mind until the shape of its significance became clear. He had files on House Targaryen. Of course he did. 8 months ago, when Wayne's sensors had first registered the anomalous extra-dimensional presence, Lex's own systems had caught the same signal. He had researched the energy signature's origin point obsessively, following the trail through dimensional physics and ancient magical theory until he had arrived at a world that operated on principles of hereditary power, so concentrated in certain bloodlines that it bordered on the metaphysical. A world where a specific family had, for 300 years, demonstrated an almost supernatural relationship with fire, with dominion, with the particular quality of authority that certain bloodlines seemed to generate as naturally as Kryptonians generated heat vision under yellow sunlight. He had then spent 6 months trying to determine which member of that bloodline was sitting in Bruce Wayne's spare bedroom. Now, apparently someone from that same world had arrived and started asking questions about it within 12 hours of touching down. Lex smiled. It was the smile of a man watching a game he had been playing in isolation suddenly acquire another player. And unlike Superman's irritating tendency to inspire cooperation and hope and all the other qualities that made him dangerous, this new player appeared to be motivated by the same fundamental engine that Lex understood best, the desire to know the truth, regardless of who it threatened. Change of plan, he told Mercy, who was sitting across from him with the patient readiness of someone accustomed to plans changing. I want a meeting arranged. Not Wayne, not the League. He looked out the window at Gotham's gray afternoon sky. The Dornish prince. Find me a way to get in front of him before Batman realizes I'm interested. Mercy nodded once. And the offer? Lex considered this. What did you offer a displaced prince from another reality who had arrived with nothing but a weapon and an intelligence that had apparently already identified the most significant secret in Bruce Wayne's household within a single morning? The truth, Lex said. About the boy. All of it. Everything Wayne hasn't told him. He straightened his cuffs with the precise satisfaction of a man making an opening move in a game he intended to win. Everyone wants to know who they really are. Even princes. Especially princes. Outside, Gotham's rain had started again, running down the window in dark rivers and somewhere across the city, in a manor on the hill. A Dornish spear leaned against a guest room wall and waited with the patience of something that had not yet found its target. The confirmation came not from Alfred, not from Bruce, and not from any of the careful architecture of protection that Wayne Manor had constructed around its most significant secret. It came, as the most important confirmations always did in Oberon's experience, from the subject himself. Not through confession, but through the unguarded moments that the truth forced out of people when they stopped watching themselves. He had spent the day learning the manner. Not intrusively, he was a guest, and he understood the etiquette of guesthood in a protective household, an on which meant moving through permitted spaces with visible purpose and keeping his more investigative impulses quiet enough that they didn't register as threat. He had asked Alfred for books and received them. He had examined the grounds. He had eaten meals at the kitchen table and conducted the kind of conversation that appeared to be simple and was not. Jon Snow had joined him for dinner. It was, Oberyn suspected, partly loneliness and partly the same pull that brought people of similar circumstance together across any cultural barrier. The recognition, however dimly perceived, of a shared condition. They were both men displaced from their native context, navigating a world that operated on principles neither had grown up with, were sustained by the hospitality of a man who protected people as instinctively as other men breathed and asked for nothing in return, except that you didn't lie to him. They had talked for 2 hours. Jon spoke carefully in the manner of someone who had been warned to be careful and was genuinely trying to honor that warning. But 2 hours was a long time to sustain careful with someone as patient and oblique and relentlessly curious as Oberyn Martell. By the end of it, Oberyn had learned the following. Jon had grown up believing himself a bastard, the natural son of a great lord, given his father's name as a courtesy, raised in his father's household, but always at its edges, that the truth of his parentage had been revealed to him before his arrival here, by someone he trusted absolutely, through evidence he could not dispute, that the revelation had not felt like liberation, but like the removal of a floor he hadn't known he was standing on, that he had come through the breach not entirely accidentally. There had been an element of choice in it, a moment where the rift had opened and he had stepped through because the alternative was remaining in a world that now wanted to use him in ways he did not want to be used. A bastard who wasn't a bastard, Oberyn said. Jon looked at his cup. Something like that. And your true father's family, what were they? The pause before Jon's answer was the length of a man deciding how much of a wall to maintain. Gone, Jon said. Mostly. Mostly, Oberyn repeated very gently. The way you repeated a word that was doing significant work. Jon looked up at him then, and in the gray eyes was something that Oberyn had seen before, in the eyes of people who carried bloodlines they hadn't chosen and couldn't put down. A combination of burden and defiance, and the particular exhaustion of someone who had been defined by their heritage so long they had nearly forgotten they were also a person. You know, Jon said. It wasn't a question. I suspect, Oberyn said carefully. I don't know. Not with the certainty I'd want before speaking it plainly. A long silence. The manor's old architecture settled around them with small sounds. My father, Jon said, was a prince. His family had ruled for 300 years. Dragons. He said the last word with the flatness of someone who had made peace with the impossible. Actual dragons. I know how it sounds. I come from a world where a woman walked into a fire and emerged with 3, Oberyn said. It sounds entirely plausible to me. Something shifted in Jon's face. The particular relief of a truth told to someone who didn't require it to be explained or justified. His shoulders dropped a fraction, his hands unclenched around his cup. Aegon, Oberyn said quietly. Your name. Your real name. Or something close to it. Jon was very still. How did you know that? Because I have spent years studying the genealogy of a dynasty that apparently exists in both our worlds, Oberyn said, and because your face is a map that any student of that dynasty would recognize if they knew where to look. He leaned forward slightly. I knew a woman once who would have moved kingdoms for you. She searched for evidence of your existence across 2 continents. She never found it. Jon's jaw tightened. Daenerys. You knew her. She was my... He stopped. Started again. She died before I came here. Things went... He shook his head, and the grief in it was old enough to have settled into the bone, rather than sitting fresh on the surface. It doesn't matter now. It matters enormously, Oberyn said, not unkindly. It matters because you are the legitimate heir to a dynasty, And in my experience, legitimate heirs to dynasties do not get to decide that their claim doesn't matter. Other people decide it for them, usually people with interest in the answer. He was thinking of Lex Luthor's advertisement as he said it, the smile that didn't reach the eyes. Because humanity deserves better. Truly, he was thinking about a world that contained actual gods and the men who hated them for it, and what such a man might do with the knowledge that the quiet young ward in Bruce Wayne's spare bedroom was the last scion of a Dragon Lord dynasty from another reality. He was also thinking about the ritual, the pre-Valyrian script, the deliberate engineering of a breach. Someone in his world had opened that door. Someone had known what was on the other side. And the question that was beginning to occupy the front of his mind with increasing urgency was whether the target of that engineering had been Oberyn himself, arriving to find what was hidden here, or whether it had been Jon Snow, sent through 8 months ago by a different hand, hidden in this world's most defensible household, waiting for something that hadn't happened yet. He said none of this to Jon. Instead, he refilled their cups and asked about the North, the actual North, the landscape and the cold and the particular quality of honor that cold places bred in their people. And listened to Jon talk about it with the homesickness of someone who missed a place they could never return to, and filed everything else under soon and carefully and not yet. But that night, alone in his guest room with his spear across his knees, Oberyn Martell began composing in his mind a list of everyone who knew what Jon Snow was, and everyone who might want to know, and everyone who would benefit from that knowledge becoming currency. It was a long list, and somewhere near the top of it, in letters that felt like they belonged in a different kind of story than the one he'd expected to find himself in, was a name he hadn't yet encountered in person. Luthor. The meeting with Lex Luthor was not arranged by Mercy. It was arranged by Oberyn, which was a distinction that mattered enormously, and which Lex, to his credit, recognized the moment Oberyn sat down across from him in the private dining room of the Gotham Grand and ordered wine with the proprietary ease of a man who had decided to treat the encounter as his own rather than the one he'd been invited to. Oberyn had found the intermediary, a Gotham information broker named Silas who operated out of a photography studio in the Diamond District. Through 3 conversations and 2 well-placed bribes, they both paid in Wayne household currency that Alfred had provided without comment and with the particular expression of a man who understood exactly what was happening and had decided Bruce would want to know about it later. The message Oberyn had sent through Silas was simple. I know what Luthor wants. I know what he has wrong. I'm willing to correct him. One meeting, public place. He chooses the restaurant, I choose the table. Lex had responded within 40 minutes. Now they sat across from each other in the amber light of an establishment that cost enough per meal to fund a small city's water infrastructure, and Oberyn studied the man across the white tablecloth with the attention he gave to every genuinely dangerous person he encountered, which was to say completely and without any of the energy that attention usually cost him, because dangerous people were the ones he found most naturally interesting. Lex Luthor was not physically imposing. He was lean, contained, dressed with the precision of someone who understood that clothing was a form of argument, and possessed of eyes that cataloged everything they touched with the impersonal thoroughness of a machine that had been built specifically to find weaknesses. He was also, Oberyn noted, the first person he had met in this world who looked at him without any component of supernatural wariness. No assessment of dimensional breach residue, no calculation of threat level against metahuman benchmarks. Lex looked at him the way one very intelligent baseline human looked at another, and that shared register of humanity, however dangerous the intelligence behind it, was oddly comfortable. Ari, you found me before I found you, Lex said. I had a 12-hour head start and considerably more resources. You were looking for leverage, Oberyn said. I was looking for information. Information moves faster. Lex considered this with the expression of a man deciding whether to be amused or annoyed, and settling after a moment on a third option, respect, administered in the minimal dose that his ego permitted. What do you think I have wrong? You think Jon Snow's identity is a secret you can use as currency? Oberyn said. You're planning to approach the boy directly, or to reveal what you know to parties whose reactions you've calculated in advance. and use the resulting chaos to position yourself advantageously against Wayne or the League or both. He sipped the wine. It was excellent, which he appreciated despite everything. And you're wrong about the currency. Enlighten me. In my world, the last person who tried to use a Targaryen heir as a political instrument discovered that the instrument had edges they hadn't accounted for. Oberyn set down his glass. Jon Snow is not a secret to be deployed. He is a young man of extraordinary lineage who has already survived more attempts to define him by his blood than most people face in a lifetime. He does not respond to leverage. He responds to truth and to loyalty and to the particular call of duty that cold country people answer when everything else has been stripped away. He met Lex's eyes. If you move against him with the tools you're currently considering, you will not gain an asset. You will create an enemy. And enemies of that particular bloodline have a historical tendency to end badly. Lex was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of a man without a response, but the quiet of a man recalculating. You're warning me off, Lex said. I'm correcting your model, Oberyn replied. What you do with the correction is your concern. And what's your interest in the boy's welfare? Oberyn considered the question honestly because it deserved honesty and because Lex Luthor would identify evasion immediately and trust him less for it. I don't know yet, he said. He carries a name that meant something in my world, a name that cost people I respected a great deal of blood. I find I am not indifferent to its continuation. Something shifted in Lex's expression. Subtle, quickly controlled, but present. The shift of a man encountering an emotion he hadn't predicted in an opponent and filing it as significant. You came from the same world he did. I came from the same world. I wasn't sent by the same hand. Oberyn leaned forward slightly. Which brings me to what I actually want from you, Luthor. Not a trade, not an alliance. Information. Your analysts have been studying extra-dimensional arrivals for months. The ritual that brought me here used a script predating Valyria by at least a millennium. I need to know if anyone on your payroll has encountered that script in the dimensional data you've collected. Lex studied him across the table for a long moment. The calculation behind his eyes was visible the way the working of a very fine watch was visible through a glass case. You couldn't see every component. But you could see the precision of the movement and understand that the mechanism was considerably more complex than its elegant surface suggested. Pre-Valyrian script, Lex said slowly, in dimensional breach data. Yes. I have 3 analysts who would find that question extremely interesting. Then find them something interesting to do. Another pause. Then with the controlled reluctance of a man making a concession he'd calculated as profitable. I'll need something in return. Of course you will. Oberyn settled back in his chair. I'll tell you what the boy's lineage actually means. Not as currency, as context. Because you are clearly intelligent enough to understand that a thing understood is more valuable than a thing merely possessed. And you have been in possession of half a truth for 8 months without understanding what the other half changes. Lex's eyes sharpened with the particular hunger of a man for whom knowledge was the only currency that actually satisfied. All of it, Oberyn agreed. And in exchange, your analysts look at the script data, and you keep your considerable resources pointed away from Wayne Manor until I have a clearer picture of what's actually happening. You're asking me to stand down from an asset. I'm asking you to invest in a better one. Oberyn raised his glass. Patience, Luthor. In my experience, the most dangerous players are always the ones who know when to wait. Lex looked at him for a long moment across the white tablecloth and the excellent wine and the careful architecture of 2 very dangerous intelligences, deciding, provisionally, that cooperation served them better than opposition. He raised his own glass. You would have been extraordinary in metropolis politics, Lex said. I'm extraordinary everywhere, Oberyn replied, and drank. Superman found out the way Superman always found out about things happening in Gotham that Bruce hadn't told him, which was to say through a combination of enhanced senses that no amount of architectural lead lining entirely defeated, an instinct for human distress that functioned like a compass needle finding north, and the particular guilt that accumulated in a man who monitored a city of millions and still somehow always felt he wasn't monitoring closely enough. He had been over Gotham on an unrelated matter, a chemical tanker listing badly in the bay, crew in danger, the kind of situation that resolved itself in 40 seconds when you could move at the speed of a hurricane and breathe underwater without inconvenience. When his hearing, ranging across the city with the automatic sweep that he'd long since stopped consciously directing, had caught a voice he didn't recognize saying a word he did. Targaryen. He had been hearing that word in whispers and in careful conversation, and in the particular hush of people discussing something they understood to be significant for 8 months. He had been hearing it from Bruce's direction specifically, which meant he had been not hearing it with great discipline, because Bruce's direction was a place Clark had learned to grant a certain operational latitude that he didn't extend to most of the world. Bruce protected people. Bruce's methods were not always comfortable, but his intentions, beneath the armor and the contingency plans and the comprehensive distrust of everything including sunlight, were sound. But Targaryen, spoken in a voice Clark didn't recognize, in a private dining room in Gotham Grand, across a table from Lex Luthor. He was outside the restaurant's window at an altitude invisible to the street within 4 seconds of processing what he'd heard. He did not go in. He listened instead, which was the choice that cost him more. The passive restraint of a man who could resolve the situation in moments but had learned, out across years of being what he was, that resolution achieved by overwhelming force left a residue of resentment and disruption that outlasted the immediate problem. He listened to the entire conversation. When it was over, when Oberyn Martell and Lex Luthor had departed in separate directions, with the careful non-acknowledgement of two people who had reached a provisional agreement they both intended to violate at the optimal moment, Clark drifted upward into the cloud cover above Gotham and stayed there for a while, thinking. He had known about Jon Snow for 6 months. Bruce had told him, which was itself significant, because Bruce's disclosure list was shorter than most people's grocery lists and far more considered. And he had told him because he trusted Clark's discretion and because he understood that Clark's particular combination of senses made the secret impossible to keep from him indefinitely. And Bruce preferred to manage information proactively rather than have it escape his management. He had told him that the young man was from another reality, that his lineage was politically significant in ways that translated poorly to their world, and that the priority was his safety. Clark had agreed, had kept the secret with the same discipline he applied to all of Bruce's confidences. But he had also over 6 months of occasional visits to the manor and brief interactions with a young man who carried himself with a quietness that Clark recognized as the particular quietness of people who had survived things they didn't discuss, formed his own impressions of Jon Snow, and those impressions had accumulated into something that now pressed against his silence with considerable force. He landed on the manor's grounds at dusk, in the space behind the east garden wall, where Bruce's exterior sensors had a gap he'd identified 2 years ago and had never mentioned, because some courtesies were expressed through the deliberate maintenance of privacy. Alfred met him at the door with the expression of a man who had been expecting this visit for approximately 6 months and had simply been waiting for the catalyst. "Master Clark," Alfred said, "I'll tell Master Bruce you're here. John is in the library." Clark found him there, sitting in one of the deep chairs near the window with a book open in his lap that he clearly wasn't reading, staring at the darkening garden with the expression of someone working through something too large for the space currently available to it. He looked up when Clark entered, and the specific quality of his reaction, recognition without surprise, the greeting of someone who had been expecting a conversation they didn't know how to begin, confirmed what Clark had suspected. He knew something had changed. "Oberyn," John said. It wasn't a question. "He's perceptive," Clark said, sitting across from him. He didn't use the cape indoors when it wasn't necessary, was wearing instead the ordinary clothes of Clark Kent, journalist and Metropolis resident, which was its own kind of honesty. "He had your lineage identified in less than 12 hours. I've been in this world my whole life, and it took me considerably longer." John set down the book. "And what do you want to tell me?" Clark considered the question, its directness, the absence of the deflections that most people employed when bracing for difficult conversation, and decided it deserved the same directness in return. I want to tell you that I understand something about being the last of a bloodline that was considered mythological, about having a heritage that other people find threatening and still others find useful, about the particular loneliness of being the only one. He met John's gray eyes. And I want to tell you that in 8 months watching you from a distance, I've noticed that you're very good at carrying weight that should be distributed differently. John was quiet for a moment. You're saying I should trust someone. I'm saying, Clark said carefully, Cornyn, that the Dornish prince currently sitting in your guest suite has already met with Lex Luthor, and almost certainly has a better picture of the forces aligning around your identity than either you or Bruce currently do. And that whatever his methods, his interest in your welfare, appears genuine in a way that Luthor's interest in anything rarely is. He paused. And I'm saying that I've been where you are. Not exactly, but close enough to know that the instinct to manage it alone is understandable and also wrong. John looked at him for a long time. The gray eyes had the quality that Clark had noticed from the beginning, an oldness that didn't belong to the face's apparent age, the accumulation of a person who had been tested repeatedly and catastrophically and had survived each test without becoming smaller, only quieter. He knows, John said finally. Oberyn, he knows what I am. Yes. And Luthor knows something. Enough to be dangerous, not enough to be right. Clark leaned forward. Which means the window where this can still be managed on your terms is shorter than it was this morning. John looked at the dark garden, at the library's old books, at the accumulated shelter of a household that had kept him safe for 8 months through the combined force of Bruce Wayne's will and Alfred's quiet excellence, and the invisible perimeter of a man in a cape who checked the grounds more often than anyone had asked him to. I need to talk to Oberyn, John said. Yes, Clark said. You do. He left John in the library and went to find Bruce, who was in the cave staring at a holographic display of energy signatures with the expression of a man who had already identified the problem and was now in the less comfortable process of identifying which of his solutions applied to it. He looked up when Clark descended the stairs, and the look between them, long practiced, freighted with the history of two people who had disagreed profoundly and repeatedly and remained beneath the disagreements something close to essential to each other, carried the full weight of what neither of them had said. How long have you known Luthor was interested? Clark asked. 6 weeks, Bruce said. And Oberyn meeting him? 2 hours. Bruce turned back to the display. I have a plan. I know you have a plan, Clark said. I want to know if the plan accounts for the fact that Jon Snow might have preferences about his own future. A pause. The cave hummed with its eternal readiness. It's evolving, Bruce said, which was as close as he came to your right on most days. And today Clark decided to accept it. Bruce called the meeting at midnight, which was when he did his clearest thinking, and also, Oberyn had come to suspect, when he felt most in control of his environment. The cave's blue light gathered them around the central workbench like a court convened in the underworld. Bruce standing, because Bruce always stood at these things, with the posture of a man who understood that physical positioning was a form of argument. Clark sitting on the steps with the deliberate informality of someone signaling that he was here as a person rather than a symbol, the Alfred present at the margins with tea that nobody touched, and the particular quality of attention that meant he was cataloging everything for later, and John sitting very still in the chair that Bruce had placed at the table's center, with the careful geometry of someone who understood that where you put people told them what you thought of them. Oberyn had been given the chair opposite Bruce. He approved of the symbolism. 2 investigators facing each other across the evidence. Luthor's analysts, Bruce began, without preamble, pulling up a holographic display that showed dimensional breach data layered over what appeared to be ancient script comparisons, have been working on pre-Valyrian script for 6 weeks independently. Not because of you, he said to Oberyn, because of the breach patterns themselves. As the script has been appearing in the energy signatures of every major dimensional tear since metal, not as noise, as signal. Oberyn leaned forward. Someone is writing in the tears. Someone or something is encoding information in the fabric of the breaches themselves. Bruce zoomed in on a section of the display. My analysts and Luthor's have now confirmed independently that the script in the breach signatures matches exactly the script from the ritual site you described in Essos. The cave was quiet except for the distant sound of water. Which means, Oberon said slowly, that whoever conducted that ritual wasn't opening a random door. They were writing an address. A specific address, Bruce confirmed, to this location, this city, possibly this specific household. John was very still in his chair. T. Clark was watching him with the careful attention of someone ready to provide support in whatever form it was needed. Alfred had set down the tea tray with a precision that suggested his hands needed something to do. "Someone sent me here," John said. Not a question. Not surprise exactly. More the quality of a thing suspected for a long time, finally arriving in the room with its full weight. "Someone sent you here 8 months ago," Bruce said, "and then sent a second person. Someone from the same world, with the specific knowledge and investigative capability to identify you. Through a second breach 4 weeks later." He looked at Oberon. "The timing of your arrival wasn't accidental. You were delayed. Something held the second breach open for weeks before releasing it. Waiting," Oberon said, "for John to be settled, hidden, for the protection around him to be established." He thought of the Essos tower, the collapsing floor, the rush of dimensional wrongness. "I was meant to find him here, in a place where the finding could happen safely." "Which means," Clark said from the steps, "that someone in your world knew about this one, knew about Bruce, knew this was a place John could be protected, and knew," Oberon added, "that I would be the right person to send after him." He was quiet for a moment, following the thread. "Someone who knew me, knew my capabilities, my history with the Targaryen dynasty, my motivation." He looked at John. "Someone who wanted you found and confirmed and, what, protected, used, returned?" John met his eyes. "Bran," he said. The name came out with a quality that was difficult to categorize. Not grief exactly, not relief. It's something between the two that had no clean word in any language Oberon spoke. He sees things. Across time. Across. He always said the world was bigger than we knew. "A seer," Oberon said. "More than that." John's jaw worked. "He wouldn't have done this without a reason." "The reason," Bruce said, closing the holographic script display and opening a second one. This one showing a network map that connected nodes Oberon didn't yet have labels for, spread across Gotham, Metropolis, and points beyond, is what concerns me. Because in the 6 weeks since Luther's analysts began working on the script, 3 other parties have started asking similar questions. He highlighted 3 nodes on the map. A research division within STAR Labs with funding I can't trace to its source. A Gotham antiquities dealer whose recent acquisitions all relate to pre-technological magical systems. And an organization operating out of the Metropolis Underground that has been collecting extra-dimensional arrivals. Not harming them, collecting them, for what appears to be a specific purpose. Oberon studied the map. "You think someone here has also been reading the breaches?" "I think someone here has known about the breaches' encoded content for longer than any of us have been paying attention," Bruce said. "And I think they've been working towards something specific, and John's identity is either the key to it or the obstacle. Which brings us," Clark said, standing now, "to the question of what we do." The question settled over the cave like weather. Oberon looked at John, at the young man sitting at the center of a conspiracy that had apparently been engineered across the boundary between realities by a brother who saw the shape of time itself, and thought about the trial by combat that he had never fought, about Gregor Clegane's hands and Aaliyah's name, and the long road of vengeance that had defined the last decades of his life. He thought about what it meant to be the instrument of someone else's plan. He thought about agency, about the difference between a man who chose his battles and a man whose battles were chosen for him. "John," he said. John looked at him. "What do you want?" Oberon asked. "Not what does Bran want. Not what does Bruce's plan require. Not what does your bloodline demand. You specifically. What do you want from this?" The gray eyes held his for a long moment. The old weight in them, the accumulated cost of survival, of identity, of a name that meant more to everyone around him than it had ever been permitted to mean to himself, shifted slightly, the way a man's shoulders shifted when he put down something heavy and felt for the first time the shape of the absence. I want to know why, John said. Why Bran sent me here. What it's for. What I'm supposed to. He stopped. I've spent my entire life being told what my blood means for everyone else. I want to know what it means for me, what I'm for, not what I'm used for. Oberyn nodded slowly. It was, he thought, the most honest and the most royal thing he had heard in this world or any other. Then we find out, he said, and the we in it was deliberate and unambiguous. It arrived with a certainty that surprised him slightly, given how recently he had been standing in a Gotham alley in the rain, knowing no one. Bruce looked at him across the workbench with the expression of a man revising an assessment. Not eliminating the contingency plan, because Bruce Wayne would die before eliminating a contingency plan, but moving the parameters of threat versus asset in a direction that acknowledged the complication of a Dornish prince who appeared to have developed a genuine investment in the outcome. There's one more thing, Bruce said. He pulled up a final image on the display, a figure caught on a Gotham surveillance camera at the edge of one of the breach sites. Large, armored in a way that didn't match any military or metahuman profile in Bruce's database, moving with the deliberate, unstoppable quality of something that had been built rather than born. Oberyn looked at it for a long moment. That, Bruce said, arrived through a breach 2 days ago. It hasn't made contact with anyone. It hasn't committed any act of violence. It has, however, been moving in a very specific direction. He zoomed in on the figure's trajectory, mapped across the surveillance network. It was moving toward Wayne Manor. Clark's jaw tightened. What is it? I don't know yet, Bruce said, but it came from the same origin point as Oberyn, and whatever it is, someone sent it. Oberyn looked at the figure on the display, at the armor, at the size of it, at the particular quality of its movement that he recognized the way you recognize the movement of a predator. Not the predator itself, perhaps. Not the exact shape of the nightmare, but the category of it. The thing built for one purpose, refined to that purpose over years or decades, incapable of redirection. Something cold moved through him. Not fear. He was not built for fear in the straightforward sense, but the specific recognition of a convergence, of threads pulling toward a single point. He thought of the mountain, of Elia's name, of the combat he had never fought. It was sent, Oberyn said quietly, to finish what the ritual started. The figure arrived at dawn. Not through the gates, it came through the east wall, through 12 inches of reinforced stone and the layered electronic deterrence of Wayne Manor's perimeter defenses, with the unhurried inevitability of something that had been walking toward this point for a very long time and had no particular interest in the obstacles between it and its destination. The wall didn't explode. It simply ceased to be in the figure's path, stone parting around it the way water parted around a ship's hull, and the security system's alarms registered the breach, and Bruce was in the cave, pulling on the suit before the first alarm finished sounding. Oberyn was already outside. He had slept lightly, which was his habit in unfamiliar places, and the particular quality of silence that preceded the wall's breach had woken him 3 seconds before it happened. The absence of the small night sounds that populated the manor's grounds, birds and insects and the distant mechanical hum of the city, and all of it going quiet with the collective instinct of small creatures recognizing the approach of something at the top of a food chain they hadn't evolved to comprehend. He had taken his spear from beside the bed and moved to the window and seen it crossing the east garden in the gray pre-dawn light. It was enormous, 8 feet, perhaps more, encased in armor that absorbed the early light rather than reflecting it, dark, composite, familiar in its fundamental wrongness, in a way that bypassed rational analysis and went directly to the older part of his brain, the part that had been in the shadow of Gregor Clegane's presence and learned in that shadow the specific texture of dread that very large things designed specifically for violence generated in the bodies of even very brave people. It was not Gregor Clegane. The proportions were different. The armor was different. The quality of its movement had a mechanical precision that flesh didn't replicate. But whoever had built it had understood the same principle that had built Clegane. that there was a threshold of size and damage capacity beyond which the psychological effect became as weaponized as the physical one. Oberyn was in the garden when it stopped 20 feet from him. It looked at him, or the helmet's visor oriented toward him in a way that implied looking. Up close, the armor was more complex than the surveillance image had suggested, layered in a way that spoke of serious metallurgical sophistication. Joints reinforced with materials he didn't have names for, the whole construction carrying the residue of whatever dimensional breach had delivered it. Old world materials assembled with new world precision. Someone had spent considerable time and resources on this. "You're not here for me," Oberyn said. His spear was lowered, held in the balanced grip that preceded movement in any direction. "You're here for the boy." The figure's visor oriented toward the manor. "I'm going to make this very simple," Oberyn continued in the conversational tone he used when he wanted to establish that he was not afraid of a thing, even when the rational response to the thing included fear. "Whatever you were sent to do, you will not be doing it this morning. I want you to understand that before we begin, because I find that clarity at the outset saves everyone a great deal of wasted effort." The figure moved. It was fast. Faster than something its size had any right to be. The speed of something engineered rather than natural. And it covered the 20 feet between them in a time that would have ended most encounters before they began. Oberyn was not most encounters. He was a man who had spent his life fighting things larger than himself and had developed, through necessity and talent, and the particular stubbornness of someone raised to believe that skill defeated mass, if the skill was sufficient. A set of responses to overwhelming force that bypassed the hesitation most people felt in its presence. He moved before it reached him, not backward, which was what it expected, but sideways and forward simultaneously, inside the reach of the first strike. The spear's shaft catching the armored arm at the joint with the precise angled force that redirected momentum rather than opposing it. He felt the impact in his shoulders and down his spine, like hitting a moving wall, and used it, spinning with the redirected energy, putting distance between them with the fluid economy of someone who understood that against something this size you never stop moving. The armor turned toward him, recalibrated. The speed was extraordinary. He barely avoided the second strike, the wind of it passing close enough that he felt it against his face, and landed in a roll that brought him to his feet 6 feet away, with the spear ready and his mind running the mathematics of the encounter with the cold clarity that combat had always given him. It was stronger than anything he had faced, faster than anything its size should be. The armor appeared to be absorbing damage. The joint strike that would have disabled a human arm had produced no visible effect. He was fighting something built to be unfightable by conventional means. Good, he thought, with a part of himself that he had never entirely understood, but had long since stopped questioning. Conventional means are not my specialty. He reached for the secondary weapon at his belt, the vial of paralytic compound that he had adapted, using Wayne Manor's laboratory with Alfred's expressionless assistance to a delivery mechanism that accounted for sealed armor. The joints, the visor seals, the gap at the neck where the helmet met the gorget, visible now as the figure turned. Millimeters of exposure that most people wouldn't have noticed, and that Oberyn had cataloged in the first 3 seconds of the encounter with the automatic precision of a man who had spent his life finding the spaces between armor. He threw the vial not at the figure, but past it, a feint, drawing the visor's tracking, buying the half-second he needed, and closed the distance again with the spear angled for the neck gap, driving the poisoned tip toward the exposure point with the full committed force of a man who understood that hesitation at the moment of commitment was the thing that killed you, not the enemy. The tip connected, not cleanly. The figure's response was fast enough to partially deflect it, the gorget rising by some mechanical reflex that reduced the penetration, but enough. Enough for the compound to begin its work. He felt the change in the figure's movement within seconds, the mechanical precision developing a fractional lag, the speed dropping by degrees that would have been invisible to most observers and were to Oberyn a clear and measurable deterioration. Whatever animated the armor, whatever principle of construction or enchantment or dimensional physics held it in its current configuration, was not entirely immune to Dornish chemistry. He kept moving, kept the spear between them, Let the compound do its work. Batman arrived from the manor's roof in a controlled descent, cape spreading in the dawn air, landing between Oberyn and the figure with the practiced authority of a man inserting himself into a situation he intended to control. Clark landed 30 feet away on the other side of the figure simultaneously, the blue and red of him catching the early light with the operatic visibility of someone who had long since accepted that subtlety was not his primary asset. The figure stopped. Not completely. Its systems were still running, still tracking, still radiating the low-level threat potential of something that hadn't finished its mission. But the combination of the compound's progressive effect and the sudden presence of two of the world's most formidable opponents appeared to produce a recalculation in whatever passed for its decision-making process. "Stand down," Batman said. Low, absolute, the voice of a man who had said those words to things considerably larger than himself and had always meant them completely. The figure's visor moved between Batman, Superman, and Oberyn in a slow, triangulating sweep. Then it spoke. The voice that emerged from the armor was wrong in the way that things translated imperfectly between realities were wrong. The words were recognizable but carried an accent and a cadence that belonged to no region of this world, and beneath them was a resonance that suggested the voice had been designed to carry over battlefield noise, across the kind of distances where individual words became indistinguishable, and only tone and volume remained. The last dragon, it said, in the particular flatness of something delivering a message rather than initiating a conversation, must be returned. The realm requires it. Oberyn felt something cold move through him that was not quite dread and not quite recognition, but contained elements of both. The realm requires it. The phrasing of obligation dressed as necessity and of someone else's need presented as universal law. He had heard variations of this sentence in every court he had ever visited, spoken by men who believed their desire was the world's requirement. "Return to whom?" he said, the figure's visor oriented toward him. "To those who hold the wheel." Jon appeared in the manor's doorway. Oberyn saw him at the edge of his vision and felt the particular frustration of a situation developing faster than his ability to manage its geometry. Jon in the doorway, the figure's visor tracking immediately to the new presence. Batman's posture shifting to account for the third variable. Clark moving slightly to position himself between the figure and the manor's entrance with the quiet efficiency of someone who had decided that was where he needed to be. "Jon," Bruce said without turning, "can go back inside." "No," Jon said. He stepped out into the garden, and his voice carried the particular quality that Oberyn had heard from him only in fragments until now. The full weight of a lineage that had commanded armies and ridden dragons and held a continent for 3 centuries, arriving without performance or announcement, simply present. "Who sent you?" The figure was still for a moment that stretched. "Those who remain," it said. "Those who remember what was lost." "Targaryens," Jon said. Not a question. "Those who serve the dynasty's restoration." Jon crossed the garden slowly, and Oberyn watched him do it with something approaching awe. Not at the bravery, though it was genuine bravery, walking toward the thing that had come through a wall to collect him, but at the quality of his bearing. The way the lineage that he had spent his life trying not to be defined by was, in this moment, the thing he was using most deliberately. He was not Aegon Targaryen, rightful heir, in the grandiose sense that courts and conspirators required. He was simply himself, fully without apology, and that fullness carried more authority than any title Oberyn had ever witnessed performed. "Tell them," Jon said to the figure, with the quiet finality of someone closing a door, "that the last dragon is not a piece to be moved. Tell them I know what I am. Tell them when I decide what to do with it. It will be my decision." The figure processed this. Then, with the mechanical deliberateness of something executing a revised instruction set, it took 3 steps backward, stopped. The visor swept the garden one final time, across Batman's stillness, or Superman's watchful readiness, Oberyn's lowered spear, and settled last on Jon. "They will send another message," it said. "I know," Jon replied. "They always do." The figure turned and walked back through the gap in the east wall and was gone into the gray morning. and the garden was quiet except for the sound of birds returning to the trees, tentatively at first, and then with the confidence of creatures reassured that the thing that had silenced them was no longer present. Oberyn lowered his spear fully, looked at Jon Snow standing in the early light of a world that was not his own, carrying a name he hadn't chosen and a bloodline he hadn't asked for, having just declined the thing that name and bloodline had been sending to collect him. He thought of the trial by combat he had never fought, of Elia, him of the long road of vengeance that had brought him through a dimensional tear to a Gotham alley in the rain. He thought about what it meant to spend a life in pursuit of what someone else had taken, and what it meant instead to stand in the morning light and simply be the thing you were, without performance, without apology. He felt something shift in him that he didn't entirely have language for. Batman was already moving toward Jon, the tactical debrief beginning in his measured way, cataloging the encounter's data points with the inexhaustible thoroughness of a man who processed everything as information. Clark remained where he was for a moment longer, watching Jon with the expression of someone recognizing something in another person that they had spent years recognizing in themselves. The weight of the extraordinary. Harn carried quietly, costing more than it showed. Oberyn walked to the gap in the east wall and studied the figure's retreating trajectory until it disappeared into the city's morning haze. He thought about those who held the wheel, about the Targaryens who had survived, in his world or in the spaces between worlds, clinging to the restoration of a dynasty that a young woman with silver hair had died trying to bend rather than break. He thought about second messages. He thought about Lex Luthor's Annalus in pre-Valyrian script and the encoded addresses written into the fabric of dimensional tiers, and about Bran Stark sitting at the center of a web that stretched across the boundary between realities, with a patience that suggested he had been watching time itself long enough to understand that the important moves were never the ones that looked important. The compound in the figure's joint would wear off in approximately 6 hours, he estimated. Whatever animating principle drove it would restore its full function. It would return to wherever it had come from, carrying Jon's message. And then whoever held the wheel would decide what the next move was. Oberyn turned back to the garden, where Bruce was already building contingencies, and Clark was quietly present, and Jon Snow stood in the early light with the particular stillness of someone who had just, for the first time, it spoke in his own mind about his own future and was discovering what that felt like. Well, Oberyn said, to no one in particular and to all of them at once, now they know where we stand. 3 days passed before the second message came, and in those 3 days Gotham did what Gotham always did when given a brief interval of relative quiet. It filled the silence with the particular industry of a city that had never learned to rest, crime and commerce and survival, conducting their perpetual negotiation in the streets below Wayne Manor's hill, while above it, in the cave and the library in the East Garden, where the wall had been repaired with the speed and discretion that Bruce Wayne's resources made possible, 4 people from 3 different realities worked through the implications of what they knew. Oberyn used the time well. Sorry, he had spent the first day with Bruce's analytical systems, working through the dimensional breach data with the methodical patience of a man who had tracked conspiracy threads across 2 continents and understood that the pattern only became visible when you stopped looking for what you expected and started looking at what was actually there. The pre-Valyrian script in the breach signatures was, as Bruce had identified, an address. But it was also, Oberyn now understood, a set of instructions. The encoding was layered. The address was the surface. Beneath it, in a second script that required knowledge of both the Valyrian linguistic family and the dimensional physics of breach formation to read, was something else. A name. Not Jon's name. Not Aegon. A name that Oberyn recognized from the deepest research he had conducted into Targaryen genealogy. A branch of the family tree that most historians had dismissed as extinct. A line that had fled Westeros a century before the dynasty's fall and vanished into the records with the completeness of people who had very deliberately chosen not to be found. He brought this to Bruce on the second day, who took it with the expression of a man receiving a piece of information that both confirmed and complicated his existing model, and spent 6 hours cross-referencing it against the network map of organizations that had been reading the breaches. the antiquities dealer in Gotham, the untraceable STAR Labs funding, the organization collecting extra-dimensional arrivals. All three, Bruce confirmed on the morning of the third day, were traced to a single source when you followed the money and the methodology far enough back. A source that was not Targaryen in any literal sense, was in fact composed entirely of people from this world, but that had been in contact with dimensional breach technology for considerably longer than metal, considerably longer than any of the events that had been identified as the multiverse's destabilization point. Decades longer. Someone in this world, Bruce said, in the cave on the third morning, has been aware of the encoded breach content since at least the 1980s, has been building towards something using that knowledge, and has been waiting, specifically, for the arrival of someone with Targaryen lineage. Jon, sitting at the workbench now with the ease of someone who had been granted access to a space that was previously managed at careful distance, looked at the network map with the focused attention of a person who had learned, in the past 3 days, that his situation was considerably larger than he had understood and had decided to meet that largeness directly rather than be managed around it. Why? Because in your world, Oberyn said, from where he stood at the map's edge, the Targaryen bloodline's relationship with dragons wasn't purely biological. It was dimensional. The dragons themselves, the largest ones, the oldest ones, were creatures that existed partially outside normal physical reality. The bond between rider and dragon wasn't metaphor. It was a literal connection across dimensional boundaries. He paused. Only someone here worked that out, and has been waiting for a rider. The silence in the cave had weight. There are no dragons here, Jon said. There are no dragons here yet, Oberyn replied, and the yet landed in the room with the specific gravity of a word doing more work than its size suggested. Clark, leaning against the cave wall with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man carefully managing his response to information that touched on things he understood intimately, said, "A dimensional bridge between here and a world where dragons still exist. Built by someone in this world," Bruce said, "using knowledge encoded in breach signatures that predate metal by 40 years. Using, apparently, the Targaryen bond as the key mechanism." He looked at Jon. "Your bloodline isn't the obstacle to whatever they're building. Why, it's the activation condition." Jon was quiet for a long moment. Oberyn watched him process it. Watch the gray eyes move through the stages of a man confronting the full scope of something he had been living inside without being able to see its edges. The expression that emerged from the processing was not fear and not resignation. It was the expression of someone arriving, finally and completely, at the knowledge of what they were actually dealing with, and discovering that the knowledge, however unwelcome, was better than the alternative. "Brand new," Jon said. "He knew all of it. He sent me here because—" He stopped. "Because this is where it was going to happen. Not despite the breach. Because of it. He put you in the safest place in this world," Oberyn said, "and then he sent someone who would find you, confirm you, honor and understand the full significance of what you are. Not to use it against you, to make sure you understood it before anyone else could use it for you." He looked at Jon steadily. "He gave you the information and the time to decide what to do with it yourself." Jon looked at him for a long moment, then quietly, "You weren't angry. When you realized you'd been sent, you didn't." "I was furious," Oberyn said with complete honesty, "for approximately 3 hours on the second day, when I fully understood the extent to which my arrival here was engineered rather than accidental. I have a profound and long-standing objection to being made someone else's instrument." He paused. "And then I thought about what the instrument had been used to accomplish. You understanding what you are, on your own terms, before the people who want to use your name as currency could get to you first." He tilted his head. "It is difficult to maintain fury at a purpose that well considered." The second message arrived that afternoon, not through a wall, not through a breach. It arrived as a letter, handwritten, on paper that had no manufacturer's watermark and no provenance Bruce's forensic analysis could trace. Delivered to the manor's front gate by a woman who had vanished from every camera in a 3-block radius before and after her appearance at the gate. The letter was addressed to Jon Snow, in a script that was partly Westerosi and partly something older, and signed with a sigil that Oberyn recognized from the furthest reaches of his Targaryen genealogical research, the extinct branch, the ones who had disappeared. Jon read it twice. He handed it to Oberyn without comment. It was short. "We did not send the armored messenger. We have been watching. We know what you are, and we know what is being built, and we want the same thing you want, for the decision to be yours. Come when you are ready. We will wait. We have been waiting for a very long time." Oberyn read it 3 times, handed it to Bruce. The cave was quiet while Bruce read it, his expression moving through its characteristic controlled sequence of assessment and recalibration. Clark read it over his shoulder and said nothing for a moment that stretched. "A third faction," Bruce said finally. "At least," Oberyn agreed. "The armored figure was sent by the wheelholders," Clark said. "The organization building the bridge is the second faction, and now this." "Everyone wants the last dragon," Jon said, went with a flatness that contained underneath it a complicated mixture of exhaustion and something that was not quite its opposite, but existed in tension with it. The particular feeling of a person who had spent years being unwanted and was now discovering that the alternative created its own category of difficulty. Oberyn looked at him. Thought, not for the first time, about Elia. About what it meant to die for a name you hadn't chosen. About what it meant, alternatively, to live for one. Not in the sense of serving it, but in the sense of carrying it forward into whatever came next, on your own terms, with your eyes open. "Then make them come to you on yours," Oberyn said. "All of them. The wheel holders and the bridge builders and the ones who have been waiting in the dark for a very long time. Make them negotiate with the actual person rather than the symbol." He met the gray eyes and held them. "You are not a piece to be moved, Jon Snow. You said so yourself 3 days ago, to something that came through a wall to collect you. Say it again. Say it to all of them. Say it until they understand." Jon held his gaze for a long moment. Then something in his face settled. Not the settling of resignation, but the settling of decision, the particular quality of stillness that arrived when a person stopped managing their circumstances and started choosing them. "All right," Jon said. "Then let's begin." Bruce was already at the workbench. Soon Clark was already thinking through the logistics with the methodical focus of someone who had done this before, had stood at the beginning of something enormous and decided to meet it directly rather than wait for it to arrive. Alfred appeared at the cave's entrance with the timing of a man who had been listening to the conversation from the stairs and had determined that the moment called for something more substantial than tea. Oberyn stood in the blue light of the cave and felt, with a clarity that surprised him by its completeness, that this was where the breach had been taking him, not to vengeance, not to the completion of old business, not to the trial by combat that had been waiting for him in a world he could no longer reach, but here, to this cave, this city, this young man with gray eyes and a name that meant something in 2 realities, standing at the beginning of a choice that was finally, irrevocably, his own. He gripped his spear, set his feet, and prepared, with the particular readiness of a man who had never in his life walked away from something worth fighting for, to see what came next. In the darkness above Gotham, something moved between the stars that was not a plane and not a satellite, and not any of the things that a city accustomed to men in capes had learned to explain. It moved with the slow, ancient patience of something that had been waiting longer than cities existed, longer than dynasties rose and fell, longer than the particular grief and fury and love that had carried one Dornish prince through a tear in reality to find a lost king in the world's darkest city. One it circled once, and then it descended. In the end, Gotham kept its secrets the way it always had, in layers and shadows, in the spaces between what could be proven and what was simply known. Jon Snow remained in Wayne Manor, no longer hidden but not yet declared, navigating the strange new territory of a person who has stopped running from their name and not yet decided what to do with it. Oberyn Martell remained beside him, because the thread he had followed from a collapsing tower in Essos had led here, and he was constitutionally incapable of leaving a thread before he understood its full length. Bruce Wayne built contingencies for 3 new factions simultaneously, and slept, Alfred reported, approximately 4 hours a night. Clark Kent wrote nothing and knew everything, and remained, as he always had, in the still point around which the extraordinary organized itself. The wheelholders sent no third messenger. The bridge builders moved their operations deeper underground. The third faction waited, as they had said they would, with the patience of people who had been waiting long enough that a little longer cost them nothing. And above the city, in the pre-dawn hours when Gotham was briefly, almost peacefully quiet, something old and enormous and entirely impossible turned slow circles in the air above Wayne Manor's hill, learning the shape of a new world, waiting for the voice it had crossed the boundary between realities to find. It would not wait much longer.